After that week, even sitting hurt, something had been changed in, no one would say what. Asterisk, the order arrived without ceremony. No explanation. No briefing. No room for questions. It was not a request, and it was not temporary. It carried the weight of inevitability, the kind that tells you refusal has already been accounted for. The assignment felt wrong immediately. Not dangerous. Not dramatic. Wrong in a quieter way. There were rules, but none written down. There was a task, but no description. There was an expectation that compliance would be immediate. The message was clear, without being spoken. This was not about choice. Asterisk, the pressure did not arrive suddenly. It seeped in. At first, everything looked unchanged. The rooms were still white. The floors still clean. The routines still written on paper. But something fundamental had shifted in how those routines were felt. Silence became deliberate. Not the absence of sound, but the careful control of it. Footsteps softened. Equipment was handled more gently than necessary. Conversations ended before they became specific. She noticed how often people stopped mid-sentence. How eyes moved away when certain corridors came into view. How questions were swallowed before reaching the mouth. There were no instructions explaining what was expected. Only behavior to observe, she learned by watching. By noticing who hesitated, who stood instead of sitting, who leaned against walls without resting their full weight. Discomfort was never acknowledged out loud. It was communicated through posture, through stiffness, through the way people shifted their balance, slowly, carefully. As if testing limits no one had named, the ethical pressure was constant, not dramatic, not urgent, persistent. Each day presented the same quiet dilemma. Continue as instructed, or draw attention. And attention felt dangerous. There were moments alone in empty rooms where the strain became personal. Not fear of punishment. Fear of understanding. Understanding would mean responsibility. And responsibility would mean deciding whether compliance was still acceptable. Time stretched unnaturally. Minutes felt long. Hours blurred. Without conversation, the mind filled the space. Questions repeated. Why this task? Why no documentation? Why the silence? But answers never arrived. Nothing violent occurred. Nothing visibly cruel. Yet the absence of explanation created its own form of pressure. It became harder to tell where duty ended and harm began by the end of this period. The silence no longer felt imposed. It felt internalized. Speaking now felt like breaking a rule even though no rule had ever been written. Asterisk. The change did not announce itself. It slipped into place between routines that had already learned how not to be questioned. Morning procedures still began at the same hour. Lights still came on in the same sequence. Doors still opened in the same order, but the spacing between things felt wrong. Checks that once required. 2 people were now done by 1. Tasks that used to involve pause were rushed or quietly skipped. The margin for rest narrowed, then vanished entirely. No one explained why. No memo circulated. No correction was offered. When a routine changed, it stayed changed. When someone noticed, they said nothing. The first visible disruption was furniture. Not removal, repositioning. A chair shifted closer to a wall. A bench rotated away from the light. Stools placed just out of reach, as if forgotten mid-task. At first it seemed accidental, then consistent. People adapted without comment. They stood longer. They leaned carefully. They waited without settling. Guards behaved differently too. Not harsher. More precise, they lingered at thresholds. They watched posture. They corrected nothing. The absence of correction became its own signal. The sense of unease did not come from fear of punishment. It came from the realization that whatever rule had changed was now self-enforcing. Asterisk. The effects appeared before the explanation. Discomfort became visible. Not through complaint, but through movement. People shifted weight constantly. They rose too quickly. They avoided stillness. The body learned faster than the mind. Time distorted. Some days passed without incident. Others felt unbearably long, not because of events, but because of anticipation. The ward atmosphere thickened, not with noise, with restraint. Equipment went unused, then disappeared. No record of removal. No replacement ordered. Absence multiplied. The lack of chairs was no longer incidental. It was patterned rooms that once invited rest, now resisted it. Walls were too bare, corners too sharp, surfaces too cold. People learned where not to go. Which rooms encouraged standing? Which corridors punished lingering? The space itself began to instruct behavior. There were moments when someone almost asked a question. A glance, a breath, then silence resumed. Pain became normalized. Not spoken of. Accounted for. A slight wince was ignored. A pause excused. A rigid posture accepted as standard. Time passed. No announcement came. One detail repeated. The absence of chairs. It appeared everywhere. In rooms that required waiting, in spaces meant for recovery, in areas once designed for stillness. No explanation followed. No acknowledgement offered. People adjusted without instruction. They leaned against walls. They knelt briefly. They stood through exhaustion. This repetition created certainty. Certainty that the absence was intentional. Certainty that asking would change nothing. The psychological lock formed quietly. When discomfort becomes routine, resistance feels disruptive. People began policing themselves, correcting posture, avoiding rest, minimizing visibility. Compliance became automatic. Subtle confirmation moment, a minor. Regulation shifted. Break periods shortened. Not announced. Not debated. No objections recorded. No adjustments requested. The change passed without resistance. That was the moment it became irreversible. Not because of what happened, because of how icily everyone adapted. From that point on, the system no longer needed enforcement. It had been accepted. The consequences did not announce themselves. They arrived later, quietly, separated from the moment that caused them. By the time anyone tried to trace them, the origin was already blurred. What followed was not punishment, not exposure, not correction. It was absence. The first signs appeared in paperwork. Records that should have been routine were incomplete, not damaged, not destroyed. Simply unfinished dates ended mid-line. Observations stopped without conclusion. Signatures were missing, not forged, not erased, never written at all. Entire pages were blank where explanations should have been. No one acknowledged the gaps. They were treated as acceptable, expected. Those responsible for maintaining records adjusted without discussion. They wrote less. They described less. They learned what not to include. This was not chaos. It was calibration. The system adapted to protect itself. Physical effects emerged slowly, not immediately connected, not clustered, not dramatic enough to demand inquiry. Discomfort lingered. Posture remained altered. Movement never fully returned to normal. Some effects were attributed to stress, others to fatigue. Most were attributed to nothing at all. Naming would have required memory. Memory would have required acknowledgement. So, nothing was named. Survivors carried the effects differently. Some avoided sitting entirely. Others learned precise, careful ways to rest that revealed long practice. No one explained why, when asked directly. Responses were brief, deflective, final, it's over. There's nothing to say that wasn't documented. The refusal was not emotional. It was procedural, as if speaking violated a standing order. Still in effect, the physical environment changed permanently. Rooms were redesigned. Furniture replaced with alternatives that discouraged stillness. Layouts favored movement. Waiting areas shortened. These changes were justified as efficiency, as optimization, as necessity. No one referenced the earlier absence. The camp continued, functioning smoothly, quietly. New personnel arrived. They learned the routines as they were, not as they had been. Without comparison, nothing seemed wrong. The erasure was complete not because evidence was destroyed, but because context was removed. Even those who remembered struggled to articulate what was missing. The harm had been normalized, absorbed, distributed, responsibility dissolved across systems, schedules, and silence. No single decision could be isolated. No single actor identified. That was the design. By the time questions surfaced years later, there was nothing solid to point to. Only patterns. Only shared reluctance. Only the same physical habits repeating across different lives. The system had succeeded not by hiding the act, but by ensuring it would never be clearly remembered. Asterisk time does not stop. It flows, relentless, but it carries silence like a sediment. Nothing marks the shift that once existed. No bell rings. No announcement. No tally is taken. Rooms are reoccupied. Furniture replaced. New uniforms arrive. The camp operates as if nothing has changed. Yet underneath the smooth operation, an invisible pattern lingers. Years later, those who survived can point to nothing official. No report, no directive, no document that says, "Here, the quiet began." Instead, they carry invisible instructions. Movements calibrated not by fear, but by memory. Sitting too long feels wrong. Pausing too long feels exposed. Even standing in place becomes a question. Am I allowed? These rules are not spoken, not written. They exist in posture, in the weight of a body against the floor, in how a hand hesitates over a chair. The quiet is not a void. It is a presence, persistent, immutable, unacknowledged. Nothing violent happened. No cruelty declared itself. Yet, the absence of explanation created a force stronger than orders. The rules of silence became internalized. Compliance was no longer observed. It was instinctive. Asterisk memory of this quiet oppression resides not in words, but in muscles, in joints, in how bones bear weight. A person may walk into a room with chairs and remain standing. They may shift from foot to foot, not because they are impatient, but because the act of resting once had consequences they never fully understood. Small actions become permanent. The body calculates movement as if someone is still observing. Hands avoid certain surfaces. Eyes glance at thresholds. Shoulders rise slightly, always alert. The mind may have forgotten the exact reason, but the body remembers every lesson, every adjustment, every unspoken rule. People develop subtle rituals. A chair is approached, examined, and often bypassed. Corners of rooms are skirted, doorways crossed with calculated angles. The logic of movement evolves around gaps, around absences, around the unspoken. The body recalls the low-level pressure of surveillance that never materialized as punishment, but existed as persistent expectation. This is not fear, not in its purest form. It is a calibration of self against invisible standards, a silent, perpetual compliance that survives long after the environment that created it has vanished in later life. These habits continue. They appear in lines at bus stops, waiting rooms, offices, classrooms, sometimes even in intimacy, and always, almost imperceptibly. The body measures as this modifies. Asterisk, what is the nature of responsibility when harm is invisible? When no one commands, yet everyone adapts. When pain is endured silently and normalized across a system. There is no individual villain here, no name to assign blame, no act to prosecute, and yet the consequences are real. They exist in bodies, in memories, in habits, in choices made decades later to avoid rest, to avoid exposure, to avoid visibility. The moral question lingers. Is survival through adaptation a triumph or a surrender? Is compliance in silence complicity, or is it instinct? Even historians struggle to categorize what happened. It is neither negligence nor cruelty in the traditional sense. It is a systemic shaping of behavior. It's an invisible architecture of expectation. And the haunting truth is that such architecture leaves no witnesses. It is absorbed, normalized, and perpetuated without recognition. By the time it is remembered, it is impossible to separate origin from adaptation. Perhaps that is the ultimate design. Not to punish, not to terrorize, but to ensure that no single act can be identified, no single voice can testify, no single memory can provide clarity, and in that clarity lies the moral weight. For all who carry these invisible habits, who shift their posture, measure their steps, calculate their pauses, there is a question that cannot be answered. Not who did this, but what does it mean to survive a system that cannot be seen? The legacy is not stories. It is movement. It is posture. It is the quiet knowledge that even in freedom, some rules are never forgotten. Asterisk, just as the story seems to have ended. As if the quiet has settled and the audience can finally exhale, the subtle pattern that had been invisible for decades reasserts itself, almost impossibly present. Years later, at the very site of the former camp, now sanitized, repurposed into offices, museums, or hospitals, the environment has been restored. Chairs have returned to rooms, benches line corridors, cushions lie neatly against walls, but no one sits. Staff drift from one doorway to another, lingering briefly, shifting weight from one foot to the other, hesitant, careful. Visitors enter expecting comfort, and instinctively lean against walls or stand at angles that avoid lingering too long, so the building itself still remembers and judges. Among them, a woman who had once been a prisoner decades earlier walks through the space. Time has lined her face with age, but her body remembers vividly. Her shoulders lift. Her spine stiffens, her hands avoid resting on any surface. A chair sits directly in her path. Ordinary, innocuous, yet she bypasses it, as if touching it might awaken an unspoken command. In that fleeting instant, the realization hits like a slow thunderclap. The rules had never been written, never spoken, never documented. Yet they had been obeyed anyway, etched into muscle memory. Posture and instinct as real as any law. The camera lingers, unblinking, on the empty chairs, on the walls, on the cold linoleum floors that have been walked this way for decades. Silent stretches taut across the frame. Then, unexpectedly, one chair creaks not, under weight. Not because anyone moved it, but as if the room itself remembered someone's absence. The sound reverberates softly, eerily in the stillness, and suddenly it feels alive, intentional, almost like a warning. The air seems to thicken, the ordinary transformed into menace, and in that moment, the audience is left holding the unease that is threaded through the story, from the first silent command to this subtle, inescapable proof. Control, once invisible, can linger far longer than the people who enforced it. And freedom itself cannot erase the body's memory of compliance.